Now listen closely, because what I'm about to say isn't just about politics, war, or borders. It's about awareness. It's about the paradigms that shape nations and the beliefs that drive generations into cycles of fear, hatred, and conflict. Conflict, especially one as enduring and complex as the struggle between Iran and Israel, is not merely a geopolitical event or a consequence of territorial disputes. It is, at its root, a manifestation of deeply embedded paradigms. Paradigms are mental programs, inherited belief systems, patterns of thinking passed down through generations, often without question. When entire societies operate under rigid paradigms shaped by fear, suspicion, or revenge, the result is a self-perpetuating cycle of conflict. This is not just theory. This is reality, observable on the ground, where every missile launched, every speech of defiance, every defensive maneuver stems from a psychological blueprint that has remained fundamentally unchanged for decades. People often believe that such conflicts are driven by policy decisions, by leaders sitting in rooms making strategic choices. But those decisions are only the tip of the iceberg. Below the surface lies the real cause, the invisible programming of entire populations. When young children in both Iran and Israel are raised hearing stories of danger, betrayal, survival, and enemy threats, those narratives imprint onto their consciousness. As they grow, those narratives crystallize into beliefs, and those beliefs become paradigms, internal models that determine how the world is in. These paradigms don't just exist in the minds of individuals. They are reinforced by education, religion, media, and cultural tradition. And when enough individuals share the same paradigm, it becomes a collective force that shapes national identity and foreign policy. No sustainable resolution can come from negotiating terms on paper while these paradigms remain intact. It's like painting over rust. The structure is still decaying underneath. Until both sides begin to examine the root beliefs that shape their perception of each other, the cycle will continue. Think about it. What if both nations weren't operating from fear of annihilation or betrayal? What if the dominant thought was not, how do we protect ourselves from them, but how do we break free from this inherited mental prison? That shift, though it may sound idealistic, is not only possible, it is necessary. This internal war, the one that takes place in the minds and hearts of people, is where the real battlefield lies. And this war is not exclusive to the Middle East. Every conflict, whether between nations or within families, follows the same principle. Beliefs shape behavior. Change the belief, and the behavior follows. But belief change doesn't come from external force. It comes from awareness. It comes from stepping back and asking, where did this thought come from? Who planted it? And does it still serve me or us as a people? Most people never ask these questions. They live and die inside paradigms they never chose, fighting wars they never questioned. Both Iran and Israel possess incredible histories, cultures, and contributions to the world. And yet both are trapped in a narrative of conflict that sacks energy, creativity, and the potential for growth. Imagine what could happen if that energy was redirected, if the mental programs that foster suspicion were replaced with those that encourage possibility. That transformation doesn't begin with diplomats or generals. It begins with a single mind choosing to think differently, one thought at a time, one awareness at a time. And then those minds begin to influence others, and a ripple begins to spread. The key to unlocking any external stalemate is internal liberation. Until individuals, especially those with influence, begin to see that they are operating under paradigms, there is no real freedom. Because as long as you are ruled by inherited patterns, you are not thinking, you are reacting. Reaction keeps the fire burning. But conscious choice has the power to change the entire trajectory of a people. Fear is a powerful emotional force. It is primal, deeply embedded in the human psyche. And when allowed to run unchecked, it distorts perception, narrows thought, and fuels division. In the context of the Iran-Israeli conflict, fear operates beneath every political move, every military preparation, every public statement. It is not always visible, but it is always present. Fear whispers that survival is not possible without control. It insists that understanding the other side is a risk, not a virtue. It convinces nations that compromise is weakness and that peace is merely a trap laid by an enemy in disguise. This fear is not born overnight. It is the product of decades, sometimes centuries, of historical wounds, betrayal, war, and isolation. It is passed down like a family heirloom, often without examination. It hides behind terms like national security and strategic interest, but its roots are emotional, not strategic. Iran fears Western encirclement, regime change, and cultural erosion. Israel fears existential annihilation, regional isolation, and the trauma of repeated conflict. Both fears are real to those who hold them. And because they are real, they demand to be acknowledged, but not obeyed blindly. Fear feeds division by framing the world in binary terms: us versus them, good versus evil, safety versus danger. Once this framework takes hold, empathy becomes nearly impossible. Communication becomes propaganda. Every gesture is interpreted as either threat or submission. Within such a paradigm, peace efforts are dismissed as naive, and calls for understanding are seen as betrayal. The human mind, when trapped in fear, becomes incapable of long-term vision. It seeks short-term safety at the cost of sustainable resolution. What happens when fear becomes institutionalized? It creates policies, education systems, and military doctrines based on mistrust. It shapes how children learn history, how media frames current events, and how leaders justify action or inaction. When fear sits at the head of the table, it rewrites the future before it has a chance to unfold. It becomes the lens through which every opportunity is viewed and ultimately rejected. And most tragically, it erases the human face of the other side. An Iranian mother and an Israeli mother both want safety for their children, but fear blinds them to the commonality. It elevates ideology over humanity. Fear can also be addictive. It gives people a sense of certainty in an uncertain world. It provides a false sense of control. It tells people, if you just build higher walls, gather more weapons, speak more defiantly, you will be safe. But the paradox is that the more people yield to fear, the less safe they actually feel, because the enemy is no longer out there, it's inside their mind, whispering that no one can be trusted. That mindset becomes self-fulfilling. It attracts the very conditions it wants to avoid. You expect betrayal, so you act defensively. The other side interprets your defense as aggression, and they react accordingly. A cycle is born, and fear keeps it alive. The only way to break this cycle is to confront fear, not with force, but with awareness. Fear loses its grip when it is seen clearly for what it is: a story, a projection, a reaction, not an absolute truth. When individuals and leaders begin to separate real danger from imagined threat, they reclaim their ability to choose wisely. Fear-based thinking says, we have no choice. Conscious awareness says, we always have a choice. And that distinction is everything. In the face of fear, people must learn to pause, not panic. They must question the automatic response, not act upon it. They must recognize that the enemy is not always the other nation, the other religion, the other people, but often the unexamined emotion that lives within. Only through this kind of inner clarity can any lasting outer peace begin to take shape. Fear may be inevitable, but being ruled by it is not. The conflict between Iran and Israel is often portrayed through the lens of nationalism, territorial disputes, and ideological differences. But beneath those narratives lies a far deeper question of identity. Nations and individuals alike define themselves through stories. Stories of who they are, where they came from, and what they must defend. These stories become boundaries that shape perception and dictate behavior. The problem arises when identity becomes fixed, rigid, and oppositional. When people define themselves only by contrast to others, we are not them, the potential for connection and cooperation disappears. Identity becomes not a source of unity, but a fortress of isolation. The truth is that identity is not static. It can evolve. It can expand. But this requires a conscious willingness to examine how we see ourselves and how those self-perceptions influence our view of the world. In the case of Iran and Israel, both societies have cultivated deeply rooted narratives about who they are and what they stand for. Iran's identity is shaped by a rich history of Persian culture, a deep connection to Shia Islam, and a sense of resistance against Western and Zionist influence. Israel, in turn, holds a powerful narrative of survival, rebirth after the Holocaust, and the right to self-determination in a historically hostile region. These identities are not inherently in conflict, but they are often positioned as incompatible. The rigidity of these identities creates a psychological barrier to peace. When people believe their identity is under threat, even peaceful gestures can feel dangerous. Compromise appears as surrender. Dialogue is seen as betrayal. But what if identity could be expanded rather than defended? What if being Iranian or Israeli didn't mean seeing the other as a permanent adversary? The mind, when trained in fear and separation, resists such a notion. But the human spirit, when awakened to its higher nature, begins to see possibility where there was once only danger. Expanding identity doesn't mean abandoning one's culture, faith, or history. It means rising above the narrow confines of inherited labels to recognize a shared humanity. It means seeing that the desire for dignity, security, and freedom is not exclusive to one side. Both nations are filled with people who love their families, who work hard, who pray for peace in quiet moments when no one is watching. But those human moments are often drowned out by political noise and ideological rigidity. When identity is based solely on difference, the other becomes a caricature. But when identity expands, the other becomes a mirror. The power of expanded identity lies in its ability to transform relationships. A leader who sees himself not just as a guardian of one nation, but as a steward of peace for all people, makes decisions differently. A citizen who sees her enemy as a fellow parent, a fellow dreamer, begins to question the narratives she has been taught. This is not weakness. It is profound strength. It takes far more courage to expand identity than to defend it. Defending is reactive. Expanding is creative. It requires imagination, empathy, and the willingness to see oneself as part of something greater. History is filled with examples of individuals who chose to expand their identity beyond tribal, national, or religious lines. These individuals became catalysts for change, not because they had superior intelligence or resources, but because they had the vision to see what others could not. They understood that the path to lasting peace is not paved with dominance, but with understanding. And understanding begins the moment we stop asking, who am I against, and start asking, who am I really? Identity rooted in fear creates war. Identity rooted in awareness creates peace. This transformation begins at the level of thought. Before policies are changed, before treaties are signed, before leaders meet at tables, identity must be revisited and reimagined, not just by the powerful, but by the people. Because the power of identity does not reside in governments, it resides in minds. Every generation is born into the world with the weight of the past resting silently on its shoulders. Traditions, stories, prejudices, and wounds are handed down, often without consent or awareness. In regions marked by long-standing conflict like the Middle East, especially between Iran and Israel, this inherited history becomes a blueprint for behavior. Young people grow up hearing the same cautionary tales, absorbing the same fears, and internalizing the same divisions that their parents and grandparents carried. Yet the remarkable truth is that with each new generation comes not just the inheritance of history, but the possibility of a new choice. History may set the stage, but it does not write the script for what must come next. The assumption that we are bound to repeat the past simply because it happened is a misunderstanding of human potential. Just as individuals are capable of personal transformation, Societies are capable of generational transformation, but that requires awareness. It requires the courage to question inherited beliefs, to challenge dominant narratives, and to ask what kind of future is actually worth building. When people see history as destiny, they surrender their creative power. When they see it as context, they reclaim their ability to choose. This is the difference between being a prisoner of the past and being a student of it. Iran and Israel are both rich in culture, intellect, and resilience. Their histories are filled with tragedy and triumph. Yet, the persistent view that these two nations are locked in a timeless struggle overlooks the transformative potential of choice. Just because prior generations responded to tension with hostility doesn't mean the current one must do the same. Just because fear has been the dominant emotion in past diplomacy doesn't mean understanding is off the table now. The only thing that binds people to repeat cycles of conflict is unconscious loyalty to inherited patterns. One of the most insidious forces in conflict is the idea that this is just how things are. That assumption breeds apathy. It convinces people that peace is unrealistic, that hostility is permanent, and that hope is a luxury. But everything that exists today was once thought impossible. Borders, governments, treaties, all of them were imagined before they were real. If imagination created those structures, imagination can create new ones. But imagination only flourishes when people believe they have permission to think differently than those who came before them. The younger generations in both Iran and Israel are growing up in a world more connected than ever before. Through technology, culture, and communication, they are exposed to global ideas and alternative narratives. This exposure is not a threat to tradition. It is an invitation to evolution. When individuals begin to see that their enemy is not the person on the other side of the border, but the mindset that keeps both sides afraid, something powerful begins to shift. The illusion of inevitability begins to crack. The false belief that history must repeat itself starts to weaken. Real progress requires people who are willing to stand at the intersection of memory and vision. People who respect the sacrifices of the past, but are not limited by them. People who honor the pain that has been endured, but do not allow that pain to harden into vengeance. Each generation must decide whether it will be a continuation or a transformation. And that decision doesn't happen all at once. It happens in conversations, in classrooms, in moments of private reflection. It happens when someone asks, is this belief really mine, or did I inherit it unchallenged? That simple question has the power to unravel decades of inherited hostility. Responsibility is the privilege of the living. While we cannot change what was, we can shape what will be. The past is not a chain unless we choose to wear it as one. Every generation is offered a fork in the road, to carry the old battle forward or to imagine a new way through it. That choice is not easy, but it is always available. Strength has long been measured by power, by the ability to assert, to dominate, to win. In the realm of international conflict, this measurement becomes the currency of survival. Nations like Iran and Israel, locked in decades of tension, often operate under the assumption that strength must be demonstrated through force, through defense systems, through bold declarations and retaliatory acts. The louder the warning, the stronger the posture, but this is an outdated model of strength. It is a model built on fear, and fear always seeks control. It masks insecurity by projecting aggression, and while it may create short-term safety, it can never build long-term peace. True strength is not found in how fiercely one can resist or retaliate. It is found in how deeply one can understand. It takes little effort to raise one's voice or flex military power, but it takes extraordinary courage to listen, truly listen, to the fears and aspirations of the other. Understanding does not mean agreement. It does not mean surrender. It means stepping beyond the narrow corridor of one's own narrative and exploring the broader landscape of human experience. When leaders and individuals can do this, they shift the balance of power, not by overpowering the other, but by disarming the illusion that violence is the only language of safety. Understanding begins with awareness. Awareness of how narratives have been shaped, how perspectives have been inherited, and how assumptions have been left unchallenged. Most conflicts are not driven by facts, but by interpretations of those facts. The same event, the same decision, the same borderline can mean radically different things to different people, depending on the lens through which they view it. When people are trapped in a single lens, every action by the other is viewed as hostile. But when people can begin to see through multiple lenses, nuance enters the picture. And with nuance comes possibility. The need to dominate arises when people feel unseen or unheard. When identity is ignored or minimized, people react by asserting it more forcefully. This is true for individuals and is true for nations. Iran seeks recognition, not just for its sovereignty, but for its cultural and spiritual legacy. Israel seeks acknowledgement, not just for its statehood, but for its right to exist without existential threat. When these desires are ignored or reduced to caricature, both sides become defensive. But when they are acknowledged, when they are heard with sincerity and depth, defensiveness begins to dissolve. There is strength in giving others the space to express their truth without immediately countering it with one's own. The strongest leaders are not those who build the biggest armies, but those who build the deepest connections. History honors those who dared to break the mold, who extended a hand when it was easier to tighten a fist. These individuals understood that understanding is not weakness, it is leadership in its highest form. They recognized that listening does not diminish authority, it magnifies it. Because when a person listens deeply, they become anchored in presence, not panic. And in that presence, they become capable of seeing the whole picture, not just their piece of it. Strength, rooted in domination, is temporary. It must be constantly reinforced and defended. But strength, rooted in understanding, is enduring. It builds trust, even among former enemies. It creates space for innovation, collaboration, and unexpected alliances. It turns conflict into conversation. And it reveals something often forgotten in the midst of political drama, that underneath the rhetoric and strategy are people. Fathers, mothers, students, teachers, artists, scientists. Human beings who are more alike than different. When strength is redefined, not as control, but as clarity, not as power over, but as power with, everything changes. Negotiations become dialogues. Security becomes mutual. Fear gives way to respect. And in that shift, even the most entrenched conflicts begin to lose their grip. Because the true battlefield is not land or ideology, it is the mind. And when the mind chooses understanding over domination, it begins to win a far greater war than any fought with weapons. In every conflict-ridden part of the world, there are always those who wait for the politicians, the generals, or the diplomats to bring change. They wait for official agreements, strategic meetings, and signed papers to determine the course of peace. But history rarely bends because of bureaucracy. It bends when individuals, visionaries, decide to think differently, act boldly, and rise above the limitations of conventional thought. In the case of Iran and Israel, where layers of mistrust, fear, and historical trauma run deep, the role of the visionary is not optional, it is essential. A visionary is not someone with all the answers, but someone with the courage to ask better questions. While most focus on what has happened or what might go wrong, the visionary asks what is possible. They are not confined by the narratives of victimhood, revenge, or inevitability. They operate from a place of purpose rather than reaction. They do not ignore the past, but they refuse to let it be the architect of the future. Visionaries are often uncomfortable, even controversial, because they disrupt the collective agreement of how things have to be. They are not guided by popularity or approval. They are guided by conviction, clarity, and a deep sense of responsibility. Peace, in its deepest sense, is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of creative possibility. It is the product of minds that are no longer chained to inherited assumptions. Visionaries in the context of this conflict are not necessarily famous figures or public leaders. They are educators who teach the next generation to think critically and compassionately. They are artists who challenge hardened narratives through beauty and metaphor. They are spiritual leaders who remind people of their shared humanity. They are even everyday citizens who choose dialogue over silence, empathy over suspicion. While politicians may be limited by their roles, bound by constituencies and power dynamics, visionaries are not. They speak to a deeper part of the human experience. They ignite the imagination of what could be. They challenge people to see their enemies not just as threats, but as fellow human beings shaped by their own fears, histories, and hopes. The visionary does not ignore complexity, but sees through it. They understand that systems do not change unless minds do, and they commit their energy to shifting thought, knowing that transformation in consciousness always precedes transformation in action. The world has seen what happens when vision is absent. Stalemates persist, hatred deepens, lives are lost, futures are wasted. But the presence of even one visionary can ripple across generations. Thinkers like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and Malala Yousafzai have shown that when someone dares to imagine a different reality and is willing to act on that vision, it can shake the very foundation of deeply rooted conflict. In the case of Iran and Israel, where so much energy has been consumed by defense, offense, and fear, the emergence of such visionaries would not just be beneficial, it would be revolutionary. These individuals do not wait for permission to speak or act. They begin where they are, using what they have. They may not hold office, but they hold influence because they live with integrity and see beyond the current moment. They plant seeds of thought that may not bloom for years, but they plant them anyway. Their commitment is not to short-term wins, but to long-term healing. They understand that vision is not fantasy. It is a decision to see what is possible, even when others cannot. The path to peace is paved not with declarations, but with the decision to think beyond the walls that have been built by fear. The visionary is the one who sees those walls and begins to ask how they were built, why they remain, and what it would take to tear them down. Not through force, but through awakening.